This episode of The Orthodox Conundrum is brought to you by Jewish Communal Fund, JCF, where strategic philanthropy meets impact. Tax season is the perfect time to open a JCF donor-advised fund, a smart, tax-efficient way to maximize your deductions while supporting the causes you care about. With JCF, you can simplify your charitable giving and recommend grants on your own timeline. Open a fund with just $5,000 and start giving with purpose. If you open a fund in 2025, JCF will grant $100 to an organization of your choice. Visit jcfny.org/Orthodox Conundrum to request an information kit. That's jcfny.org/Orthodox Conundrum. The link is in the description of this podcast.
There needs to be some sort of serious process by way of which not only do we engage with the sources, but we're able to demonstrate that there are serious Gedolei Olam who are living today, not who lived thousands of years ago, because that's exactly the question very often. Well, what did the ideas that were expressed thousands of years ago, how are they to be applied today? Are they to be applied narrowly, in a literalist fashion, in a fundamentalist sort of way, or are they to be reinterpreted or at least applied differently in a different socio-religious reality? Well, that requires Gedolim. When all the Gedolim, or so many Gedolim, lock, stock, and barrel, are opposed to your positions, that becomes deeply problematic. And he did not cite Gedolim who agreed with him. He simply told you why everyone else is wrong and he was right. That's not only mean, that's only nasty, that's not only poisonous. Not only that, but the very process that he undertook and the way that he engaged with Torah sources and the interpretive process of Torah Shabbat Peh is inconsistent with what has been accepted by Gedolei Yisrael themselves as a legitimate halachic process.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. On February 25th, an article on Arutz Sheva's website by Yitz Goldberg was headlined, "Is Rabbi Kahane Making a Comeback on Social Media?" The same day, the Jewish Chronicle published an article by Jane Prinsley entitled, "Why Are Some Pro-Israel Influencers Suddenly Promoting Meir Kahane?" Her article offered a range of examples of relatively well-known social media personalities who have been promoting Meir Kahane and his ideas, particularly in the wake of the return of the murdered bodies of Shiri, Ariel, and Kfir Bibas. Looking through that list, it's clear that the comeback of Kahanist thought as acceptable in certain corners of the United States is far from a marginal phenomenon associated with only one or two influencers. Instead, it represents a situation where many people are asserting that some of Meir Kahane's philosophy should be admitted into the marketplace of Jewish ideas and should not be considered beyond the pale. We all experience formerly unimaginable fury directed towards Hamas because of its unthinkably evil actions. The solution, however, is not to resurrect Meir Kahane's ideas, which were extremely problematic no matter how you look at them, halachically, morally, philosophically, or theologically. And in this episode of the podcast, Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky and I will try to explain why that's so. Why is it worth talking about this? Certainly not to condemn those who have cited Meir Kahane. Although I'm sure that they're very mistaken, I also know that they do so with Israel's best interests in mind. But for exactly that reason, I think it's imperative that we openly discuss what Meir Kahane said and why it's so problematic from a Torah perspective. This will hopefully cause those who are citing him, even if they say they don't accept everything he said, to think twice about citing him at all. It will also give information to those who reject Meir Kahane implicitly, but may not totally understand why they need to do so. Let me make it clear that when I explain that I think his ideas should not be admissible, I am not in any way referring to any specific person who's been defending him. And I'm also not comparing President Trump's Gaza transfer proposal to Meir Kahane's ideas in any way. In fact, I think that describing that plan as Kahanist, even if you're strongly against it and believe that it's terribly immoral, betrays a misunderstanding of what Kahane actually believed and advocated. Again, I'm bringing this up now because it seems that Kahane is regaining some respectability in certain circles, and I'm convinced that we need to stop it before it grows any further. We'll get to our conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast. And JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky is a Jewish thought leader and educator whose teaching and writing explores balanced judgment, civil discourse, and Jewish manhood in an age of confusion. He has published dozens of articles in Tradition, First Things, and the Lair House, recently edited a new volume of Rabbi Norman Lamm's Talmudic essays, and is writing a book on Job, examining the interplay between relationships and faith. He directs Judaic Studies at Mainline Classical Academy and the Lamb Legacy Archives, and works as an independent editor of scholarly Jewish works. He lives in Lower Merion, Pennsylvania, with his wife and 3 children. Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky, thank you for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I'd like to start by making something very clear, that I'm not going to be an objective outside observer saying that let's find out about the thought of Meir Kahane and decide if it's something worth pursuing. I'm very against the idea that he is allowed in our normal public discourse in a regular sense as an acceptable opinion. And I believe you feel similarly, although you can tell me if you feel differently. Today, we're working from the perspective that this is somebody whose ideas should be rejected. Are you in agreement with me on that particular point?
I am.
Okay, so let's open up by talking a little bit about some of the ideas that Meir Kahane advocated, some of the ones that I think are worthy of condemnation.
Sure. So one of the things that's I think is really fascinating today is that Kahane gets kind of thrown around, sometimes by people who know his ideas better in greater depth, and other times kind of like a very simplistic way of presenting it, almost that kind of flattens differences between him and some of the discourse today. Setting that aside, though, I think it is important, therefore, for the reason that you say, to kind of just start by outlining some of his major ideas. So here are a couple I think that are particularly relevant for us now. If I were to kind of summarize his overall perspective, what I would say is that he really very much advocated for what I would describe as a Jewish kind of supremacist theocracy. So in other words, this is not the totality of his perspective. So certainly before he made Aliyah, he was advocating for Jewish power even outside of a state context, but especially once he came to Israel in 1971, especially after he founds Kach, even beforehand, but certainly once he's in Israel and influencing things there, starting his party, starting to get involved in politics, ultimately banned. But as long as he's involved there, he's really very much advocating for what I would describe as essentially, as I say, supremacist in the sense that he did not believe that according to authentic Judaism, that there can be any equality whatsoever between Jews and non-Jews. The entire notion of human rights, what some would argue is based on Tselem Elokim, he essentially completely disregarded as essentially an external graft, an inauthentic graft onto Judaism. And therefore he maintains that authentic, true Torah dogma ideology maintains that Jews are superior to non-Jews, period, end of story. And anyone who thinks otherwise is essentially grotesquely misreading, and probably willfully, at best ignorantly misreading Jewish texts, number one. And number two, in terms of the theocracy, he believed that accurate reading of the role of Judaism, the role of the Jewish state in the public sphere in Israel in particular, is very much, as I say, a theocracy in the sense that democracy is pasul, it's disqualified. In his view, it's completely antithetical to Torah true Judaism. And in Kahane's view, really we have to replace democracy with theocracy, with Jewish law as not only mandated upon mandatory for all Jews, but also something that is coercively imposed upon all Jews. Alongside this perspective is he also gave a lot of credibility to what I would describe as Arab fundamentalism, as we might describe it nowadays. In other words, those who maintain that Judaism and that Judaism or that Jews should be essentially, if not killed, should be expelled, and so on and so forth, have no place in Judaism. In Israel, rather, he actually maintained that this position, which is again currently kind of associated with with Arab, certain Arab ideologies in Gaza, the West Bank, elsewhere. He maintained that that's authentic Muslim, or at least Arab ideology as well. In other words, that there's a zero-sum game here that's being fought between authentic Judaism and authentic Arabs, or authentic Arab Muslims. He did not think that we should try to persuade them in any way that their views are incorrect, but rather that we should acknowledge that their faith mandates that they do exactly what they're trying to do, and that we have to be honest about that, and therefore they need to be expelled. If not expelled, they need to be killed if necessary, lest their authentic ideology lead them to expel us or kill us first.
I'd like to just expand on a few of those points, and if I say anything with which you disagree, please let me know. I think it's important to note that when he talks about expelling the Arabs from Israel, if they want voluntarily, and if they refuse voluntarily, then to force them out. He's not speaking about Yehuda v'Shomron, the West Bank. He's not talking about Gaza. He's talking about those, and he's talking about Muslims who live in Nazareth. He's talking about Muslims who lived in Jaffa. He's talking about Muslims who live, or Arabs really, who live anywhere in the state of Israel. This is talking about Israeli citizens, the 20% of Israel, which is made up of Arab citizens of the state. He was talking about having them leave as well. In fact, I think his official policy was if they want to live in Israel as non-citizens with no voting rights, they can do that. And if they don't accept that, then they should be expelled either voluntarily or forcibly. Is that correct?
I think that's right. I would only add, Scott, that was true not only for Arabs, that was true for all non-Jews. Right. So in other words, the concept of ger toshav, which is of course developed extensively in the Gemara and later discussions, essentially to him, it meant exactly as you describe it, that they're required to, if they accept the seven Noahide laws and believe in God, then they would be tolerated or permitted to live in Israel in the way that you described, but not only Arabs. And this is true of all non-Jews. The concept of ger toshav is not limited to others. So it would be, we would add, so not only Jews and others, but the Jews and others, to be clear, but Christians also would be expelled. Nationality or race would be irrelevant. The point is just simply non-Jews.
Now, how would you answer his claim, as you said before, that he's speaking authentic Judaism? That's something he said frequently. He said, if you disagree with me, you're not disagreeing with Kahane, you're disagreeing with the Torah. Now, I reject that forcibly. I'd like to hear your take on that.
Sure, I disagree strongly. I think it's really quite persuasive as a matter of rhetoric, but also quite illogical and really an indefensible claim. What Kahane is really saying is that his interpretation of Judaism is the only legitimate one, and that's deeply problematic. It's deeply problematic for a couple of reasons. First is I would say the process or the methodology that he uses to arrive at his conclusions. Essentially, what he does is he, quite frankly, if you take a look, and there are countless examples I'm happy to give, Scott, but he essentially cherry picks the Jewish sources that support his particular positions about Aliyah, about his interpretation of ger toshav, about religious coercion, of which he was a tremendous fan. He said if there were a Sanhedrin that were established, we would implement the death penalty. And so on and so forth. His readings of the sources essentially start with certain early sources, which he felt, for whatever reason, based on his ideological predispositions, were correct, were dispositive, and he essentially not only rejects other sources, but he actually very often ignores them. So if you read many of his treatments of these issues in his books, especially his more, I would say, ideological works, for example, the Jewish idea, I would say, is considered his ideological manifesto, and in other works of his machshava, where he really kind of analyzes halachic issues, hashkafic issues, and so on. What he does is essentially he presents only his view. So the first thing that he does is he kind of gives us certain original sources that are that are cherry picked. That's the first thing that he does. So that's how he's defining Kahanism as those sources that are consistent with my ideology. That's number one. Number two, he essentially ignores the entire history of the development of Jewish law or any positions that might be later positions or interpretations of those original sources that might be completely at odds with his interpretation. Not only did he reject those sources, but he would dismiss rabbis who disagreed with him as Hellenists in kind and gentle moments when he was feeling mild-mannered, and much worse. He did this in writing. He did this by getting up in places like Yeshiva University, mercilessly mocking Rosh Soloveitchik, as Rabbi Karmi has testified, and countless other examples. In other words, Gedolei Olam, leading rabbis who do not disregard the same sources and, quite frankly, are far outrank Kahana in terms of their Torah scholarship and their very right to weigh in. They just simply interpret the halacha differently. So, when it comes to, for example, Aliyah, let's take that as one example. He talks about the mitzvah to make Aliyah. Now, others who have very, very strong positions about the centrality of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as a mitzvah that's biblically mandatory. There are many others who have this perspective, of Kook and others as well. But what differentiates Kahana is that he, only very often cites the positions that are consistent with his view. He doesn't deal with the Rambam. He doesn't deal, who seems to maintain, at least in one place, that there is no mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. He doesn't quote Tosfot, who cites Rav Chaim Cohen, the Gemara in Ksuvos, who seems to say that there's no mitzvah b'zan hazeh. He certainly doesn't quote Rav Moshe Feinstein. Any of these views, he doesn't quote the opposition or what might have suggested otherwise, and then explain his interpretation to maintain or to argue why they're incorrect. Instead, what he does is he simply cherry picks the sources that he prefers, as I say, and either antagonistically disregards or mercilessly mocks, quite frankly, the opposition, which I find to be really abhorrent and an unacceptable mode of discourse, especially at a time of such polarization and such a disintegration of civil discourse. So either just cites the verses, the sources that he prefers, and or just completely ignores any alternative modes of interpretation.
You mentioned that you have countless examples. You mentioned right now the idea of moving to Israel. That's one example. Could you give another example or two of how he misuses sources?
Sure. Let's take the issue of Kfir Bibas. So the question of religious coercion. So Kahane insists that a Torah true reading will lead us to the conclusion that, as the Gemara talks about, just as the Torah and the Gemara and the Rishonim, the medieval commentaries, talk about the idea of not only the Torah being mandatory, obligatory upon Jews, that there are certain punishments that are associated with that. Now, how does that play out nowadays? So according to Kahane, it's very simple. Either you believe that nowadays we should punish all sinners, so we should ban intermarriage, but that was really just the tip of the iceberg for him. That was just one particular piece of legislation that he pushed. But he also maintains that there should be punishments for Jews across the board. We should, whether it be imprison them, we should find whatever penalties work. And again, if there were Sanhedrin, that we would put them to death for these sins. Now, certainly, is that not a plausible reading of our tradition? Sure, that's plausible, but it also ignores a massive history of interpretation, considering what happens when we consider the question of appropriate punishments during a liberal time, when God's presence is not immediately manifest, when not everyone necessarily has the same halachic background. There are concepts of tinokot shenishbu. There's a massive literature about these issues, including the Rambam himself, whom he cites when it seems to support his positions and completely ignores, as I say, doesn't even introduce very often into the discourse when the Rambam does not seem to fit into Kahane's prior ideological positions. So then you have a massive history of all of these issues, and I'm just mentioning a couple of them. There are many, many, many more. So according to Kahane, just in brief, the Meshech Chachma, who discussed this issue extensively, the Rambam, you'd mentioned the Chazon Ish, who talks about how we don't apply these punishments nowadays. Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Rav Kook, the elder Rav Kook, first chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine, All of these individuals are certainly qualified as Gedolei Olam. Yet, in Kahane's rhetoric, they are Hellenists who don't know the first thing about Judaism, or worse, completely misconstrue, disregard, and make a mockery of authentic Torah Judaism equals Kahana. And in his view, all of these are to be disregarded as complete misrepresentations of what Torah true Judaism is.
I want to go a little bit deeper, Tzvi, because all of that shows why he was not speaking properly towards Gedolei Olam, who knew much more than he did. That doesn't explain, however, why his interpretations are necessarily wrong, such that they should be rejected. In other words, his methodology, where he rejects other people and pretends they don't exist as authentic Jewish ideas, that is wrongheaded. It doesn't necessarily, however, explain why his ideas are incorrect. Someone can still point to them and say, this is an expression of Torah thought. How do you respond to that? Even if he's uncouth in his way of expressing it, he's still reading sources.
Sure, he's reading sources, but there's an accepted methodology of psak halacha. And what Kahane is essentially doing is he is ignoring that methodology. And he's quite frankly not qualified to do so. I don't think anyone who looks at the situation objectively would disagree with the two following points. Number one, he was a Torah scholar. Number two, he wasn't a Gadol b'Yisrael. He was a lamdan. He's well educated. He received smicha from Meir in Brooklyn. He was a Yodea Sefer, and he knew his stuff. But in our age, we sometimes forget, in the age of the internet, that we have sometimes allowed for a flattening of halachic discourse. Legitimate halachic discourse, there needs to be some sort of serious process by way of which not only do we engage with the sources, but we're able to demonstrate that there are serious Gedolei Olam who are living today, not who lived thousands of years ago, because that's exactly the question very often. Well, what did the ideas that were expressed thousands of years ago, how are they to be applied today? Are they to be applied narrowly in a literalist fashion, in a fundamentalist sort of way, or are they to be reinterpreted or at least applied differently in a different socio-religious reality? Well, that requires gedolim. When all the gedolim, or so many gedolim, lock, stock, and barrel are opposed to your positions, that becomes deeply problematic. And he did not cite gedolim who agreed with him. He simply told you why everyone else is wrong and he was right. That's not only mean, that's only nasty, that's not only poisonous, toxic for discourse, for Jewish unity, and so on and so forth, which he insisted that he was all about Jewish unity. But these very tactics undermined it. Not only that, but the very process that he undertook and the way that he engaged with Torah sources and the interpretive process of Torah Sheba'al Peh is inconsistent with what has been accepted by Gedolei Yisrael themselves as a legitimate halachic process.
I'd like to add to what you said and mention beyond the halachic mistakes that he's making in the sense of not following the process of a theological mistake, which I find to be egregious. I'm going to read something which he wrote. You can comment if you like on it. It comes from his book, Uncomfortable Questions for Comfortable Jews. And some of his policies obviously would have led to international sanctions and the United States blocking aid, etc. And he answers that and say, how are we going to deal with that should my program be implemented? And apart from saying he doesn't think they actually will cut aid, beyond that he said, I'm going to read now, but above all, in answer to all the fears and trepidations of timid and frightened Jews of little faith. What is wrong with you? Whatever happened to the people of perfect and classic faith? Did it ever occur to you that the God of Israel is mightier than Ronald Reagan or any other American president? This is written during Reagan's term. Why is it that you do not understand that when the Jew does God's will, that he protects him and saves him from his enemies? Whatever happened to the people of the book, the people of faith in the God of Israel? The pity is that we have long since stopped opening the book, hence have long since stopped having faith. Well, open it again and study it and practice it and believe in it. We are the chosen people, and if we do his will, why, he must do ours. To me, that line, he must do ours, is a theological mistake, a Jewish mistake of the highest rank. We are not prophets. We don't have an Urim V'Tumim. For anyone to say that God must do what we want him to do because we're fulfilling his will is absurd and extraordinarily dangerous. And apart from the halachic problem you mentioned before of not following the process, which is not incidental to it, but is an aspect of its divine nature, beyond that is the fact that we're talking about a theological monstrosity. That's my take. Do you agree with me?
I agree with you on that point. I just want to add that I think that there's a certain hypocrisy here as well. I think it's important to point out. In other words, if you're going to found the Jewish Defense League, the JDL, if you're going to declare, for every Jew at 22, if you are going to maintain that Jabotinsky inspired, but religious Zionism, right? That is militant and that is proactive, is the way to establish God's sovereignty in the world. Then what you've done is you have said that the classical pietist approach is incorrect. You can't then turn around and say, "Oh, you people who want to work in this world and use naturalistic means to accomplish, concrete political and religious goals. How dare you? What heresy!" That's completely hypocritical. It's highly inconsistent. And Scott, I want to add one thing as well, that it's not about the halachic process, but a different point, which is you mentioned the word chilul Hashem. So I think it's important to pick up on that. Now, I think it's important to be careful here. I think that sometimes we have, at times, as certainly diaspora Jews, Israelis as well, have sometimes allowed the fear of international recriminations to to paralyze us a little bit. And I think one of the things that we've learned since October 7th is that, and long before that, quite frankly, 50 years prior, certainly since the time following the Yom Kippur War, is that sometimes we need to say that there are hypocrites, that there are people, whether at the UN or otherwise, who are wielding concepts like human rights as ways to put us in our place and as ways to essentially to wield anti-Semitism. And I think we have to be very honest about that. At the same time, Chilul Hashem is a crucial overarching religious category. Kiddush and Chilul Hashem are two of the most foundational halachic elements in our system. And it is important to note that if someone establishes a conception, a theological and practical program for Judaism that amounts to what is essentially a Chilul Hashem, it's no coincidence that the Rambam places the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, the prohibition against Chilul Hashem, at the beginning of the second chapter of Hilchos Yisodei Torah, the very foundations of the halachic system. So these are not afterthoughts to be overlooked. The concept of Kiddush and Chilul Hashem are essential. I would argue, others can disagree, but I would argue that his theology is inherently very much a Chilul Hashem, and that itself is an additional theological objection that we should hold against one who is truly committed to a full-throated Kahanist ideology.
Why would you define it as a Chilul Hashem?
I think that the argument that we are essentially, first of all, creating an approach that forwards Jewish power and Jewish theocracy as the essence of Judaism, rather than, for example, the relationship with God, rather than seeing the state of Israel as not an intrinsic, certainly as an essential good, but not an exclusive good, but one that is meant to forward the covenantal relationship between God and Israel, as opposed to Jewish power, which seems to sometimes devolve into a goal in its own right. I think that someone whose entire approach to the halachic process is one that mocks that dismisses, that gets up again at the rostrum and just calls Gedolei Hador Hellenists. I think this is not the way.
I'd like to ask you about the moral problem involved. I'm curious what you think about that particular issue, which I assume has something to do with defining it as Chilul Hashem. Apart from whatever halachic objections we have, his program is fundamentally racist. If you look at what he wrote and just read what he says, he is unquestionably a racist. And the question then becomes, apart from being a Jewish supremacist and a racist, do we care? In other words, the fact that he's a racist, someone might say in defense, well, if that's what the Torah says, then how can I argue against it?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's important to be a little bit precise here, first of all. I think we sometimes use the word racist in a kind of like a broad brush sort of way. Race is literally actually has of course a technical meaning. So I would say it's racist if you want to use that term, but I think it more precise, it's as we say, supremacist. In other words, the world is divided. His notion of Jewish chosenness is one in which the world is irrevocably divided between the Jews and everyone else. The Jews are superior; they're the chosen people, not just chosen, but are inherently superior to all others, and that's kind of the that's all we have to say now. So I think it's just important to define terms and to be more precise, or to be precise in terms of how we present even those with whom we have ideological disputes. If we, I'm not saying that you or Scott, of course, but I'm just saying this is a tendency that we tend to find as well, which is a danger. Is to those who dismiss Kahana sometimes either might misrepresent or oversimplify his views as well, and this does us no favors, both for the sake of MS, for truth, but also for the sake of persuading those who might be receptive to our ideas, but might say,
then
hey,
let me just explain what I mean, if you don't mind, for
Yeah.
1 second, Tzvi, because I agree with both terms in the sense that he is both a supremacist in the sense that Jews are the chosen people, which we do accept. But I think most people this side of the Kuzari would argue that this is more a goal, something to live up to, a responsibility, rather than some sort of inherent racial quality. And beyond that, he also, it seems to me from his writings, is very anti-Arab specifically. The way he writes about Arabs is not the same as he writes about white Americans, for example. And the way he writes about white Americans is not the same as he writes about black Americans. So when I use the word racist, I don't simply mean he thinks the Jews are better. I mean that he has certain races that he denigrates.
Gotcha. Understood. I think that was, so I would agree with that 100%. I thought you meant it in context of our prior discussion. So that's why I misunderstood. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. Look, it's unacceptable to be racist. We can't walk around and talk about, all of our basic beliefs unless, if you want to go back to slavery, by all means, go ahead. But I think we need to be honest about what we're willing to accept as a legitimate Jewish ideology and what's not. And I simply think that that's Achil Hashem. Now, Kahana, you can call him a racist. This is the trouble with these conversations, right? So, as someone once said, that one man's reductio ad absurdum is another man's in hachinami. I think I heard that from a couple of people, but just to kind of unpack that, right? Like I can make an argument, in other words, that says that your perspective would lead us to kind of a completely absurd conclusion. So reductio ad absurdum, and then someone will say, you're right. What you see as absurd, I see as Torah true, and everything else is wrong. So I don't think that from a logical perspective, calling someone racist and who says, if Kahana were sitting here with us today, you might say, yeah, the Torah is racist. What's your problem? That could be. So I think it's hard to say, well, you're a racist. It's just hard to persuade people just purely on those grounds. But I think that there's another point. Not only I think racist is obnoxious, even someone would say, and I think it's wrong. It's against the Torah. I think it's incorrect, but that might not be the most successful way of persuading people, especially at this moment in time. But nevertheless, I think it is important to say that a straightforward reading of the Torah is completely against anything that is racist, including as it applies to Arabs and to African Americans. And African Americans was, I think it's important to point out, not only was he racist there, but he also was wrong. It's very interesting. It's a Kahana Tzadak. Kahana was right. I think it's important to point out that his racist views of the race wars, or the racial tensions that emerged in urban communities in the United States in the late 60s and in the early to mid 70s, he said this in of itself means the end of Judaism in America unless we brandish guns. Well, fast forward 50 years, I think we largely did not brandish guns in that same way, and we're still here. So I think this notion that he's a prophet and that he got everything right, I think is wrong. Many, even his admirers, have said that that his predictions about the realities on the ground in Israel have proven more accurate than his predictions with regard to America, which if you're one for two as a prophet, that makes you a Navi Sheker. It means that we should take your ideas perhaps seriously when they have something to contribute to the conversation, but we shouldn't just imagine that you got everything right. I think that's important too. But to come back to your question about the racism, it's just not true that there are Torah sources that say that Arabs are are to be discriminated against. There are no Torah sources that say that African Americans are going to take over Jewish communities and mistreat us and abuse us until we go away. That's just not only is that factually wrong, as I say, but it's also just it's not in the Torah. For someone who walks around trumpeting all these Torah sources and yet didn't have Torah sources to back up any of these discriminatory ideas, I think your accusation is spot on.
Okay, let's now move from what he said into the ways that his thought is now being seen as acceptable in some corners of the United States. You're there and I'm not. Can you tell me what you've seen there?
Sure. What I'm seeing is really two things. I think it's important to recall that his ideas have had a certain degree of popularity in the United States for 50 years and longer. He published in at least one major Jewish newspaper for decades. Had a column there. His ideas have not really fully gone away. I think at any point they've had, depending mostly on the situation on the ground for Jews in America and in Israel. I think he's had rises in popularity, dips in popularity, and we're seeing a rise again. So the first is that his ideas here have always been out there. They've always have a degree of popularity. And what you're seeing a lot now, number one, is that people who are now older, who have been champions and advocates for his ideas, and have been pushed out of the mainstream over the last couple of years, and especially over the last couple of months, year and a half, and the last couple of months, especially with the discussions now about the day after and the Trump proposal idea and so on. I think you're seeing those people come out again. That's number one. In parallel to that, you're seeing really over the last month or so, especially, not only, but especially, a rise in references to Kahane in the Anglo internet social media community, especially. You're seeing prominent people quote him, reference him, saying that we have to acknowledge that he was right about certain key things. He was honest, he was accurate, and that if we're not honest about the level of hatred and extremism among Arabs who seek our annihilation, then we are not giving him the credit that is due. So we're seeing that as well. The last piece that we're seeing in those same social media circles, especially among young Jews, including Jews who I think may or may not necessarily really understand his ideology thoroughly. It's one thing if I was around when he was, coming up through the ranks. It's another thing, and I kind of, grew up reading his stuff and so on and so forth. And versus now I'm just kind of quoting him, but I'm not just, it was never necessarily immersed in his ideas, so that he's being misrepresented as well. We're also seeing him among young people use not only to say that he had certain ideas that we need to acknowledge that were absolutely true and therefore should be embraced, and we should go back to reconsider other of his ideas. We're also seeing being used as a kind of an ideological cudgel against antagonists. So, for example, people on the right are now saying, well, I'm not a Kahane supporter, but those leftists are accusing me or wielding Kahane ideology as a way to discredit me. And so I'm not the one who's raising Kahane. It's actually the left that is. That I see as a kind of I think it's inaccurate. And I think it's also a kind of a sort of reversion to some of the same tactics, kind of heavy-handed tactics that Kahane himself used, I think, in a sort of, if not poetic justice, but there's sort of a poetic parallel there. So we're seeing that as well.
I have several questions to ask about that, but I'll ask about that last point first and flip it. To me, it seems that if we talk about Trump's proposed plan of transfer from Gaza, whatever it exactly is, or forget for a moment how it ever would be carried out. Let's leave that aside for a moment. People are describing that, I hear sometimes, as a Kahanist type plan. Opponents are saying that. And you said the people on the right are saying by calling it Kahane, you're trying to discredit it. I'm not talking about discrediting or giving it credence right now. I'm talking about the idea that it's actually a Kahanist plan. There, I think, the complaints that calling it a Kahane-like plan is an attempt to discredit it may be accurate. It may be an unfair description. The sense that it's not really a Kahanist plan, in the sense that Kahane was talking about every Arab in Israel, regardless of his or her political philosophy or religion, every non-Jew, frankly. And now we're talking about a state, essentially, which has been at war with Israel in a very specific area. And it's a very, very different situation. One may disagree with it, but I think calling it a Kahanist plan ignores the quote-unquote vast corpus of other things that Meir Kahane said that simply don't relate to that. as well as the fact that there was a huge moral and ethical difference between stripping citizenship from loyal citizens of the state of Israel and transferring people who have been at war with the state of Israel. Do you
Yeah,
agree with
I
me or
think that
disagree?
yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think it's really important to be precise in terms of what we're talking about. There are countless points that anyone, any number of Israelis and Americans and others as well in the Jewish community, pro-Israel community, right, left, and center, who that they find abhorrent among Kahane's ideas and just completely inconsistent with Torah Judaism, and have absolutely nothing, as you say, to do with all the conversations today. One need not be a racist. One need not hold that all non-Jews should have either no status or second-tier citizen status. In the state of Israel, one need not hold from kfiyat datit, religious coercion, and so on and so forth. Down, kind of down the line, one need not deride democracy as a Western graft of Hellenist ideas in order to hold that our security, when looked at from a very level-headed standpoint, requires us to take measures that we otherwise might not have conceived, and that what is moral under a situation that we have now in Gaza is it requires a very level-headed, very serious and sobering, honest and very painful decisions about what it is that we need to do. So it's true that Kahane made some of those points, and that's not irrelevant to our conversation. But it's also true that he held of, as you say, all sorts of other points that are really completely beside the point. And if we sum up by saying Kahane Tzadak with our slogans, we have a nice slogan, but we're not really being intellectually honest.
Do you think that there's a problem when somebody says, as I've heard many times, especially over the past few weeks, I don't agree with everything Meir Kahane said, but you have to admit that he was right about X, Y, or Z? To me, invoking him at all shows a misunderstanding of what he represented. But do you think there's a problem simply in using him at all? I guess in different terms, is it right that he should be canceled altogether? Or can we say, well, he was wrong about 99%, but in this 1% he was correct?
So I think that that's a great question, Scott. It's such a live issue today. I'm really glad that you raised it. My view is that whether he was correct about certain things is different than whether or not it is healthy or wise to introduce him into our discourse. And here I want to set aside some of the points that we've already made. I think that there's some other pieces here as well. First of all, it is true that Kahane, I think, had very important things to say, and not only Kahane, others as well, about the ways in which we need to be honest about perceiving our enemies. I think where he was absolutely wrong is to use a kind of a racist, Jewish supremacist kind of theological basis for that. But I think that stripping away and setting aside his theological arguments, I do think it is firstly accurate to say that he, and again others as well, were correct in saying that we do run the risk of not being honest about the extent of our dangers, and therefore the policy decisions, painful as they may be, that need to be made, because we are not realistic and honest about the extent of enmity, of a desire of anti-Semitism, desire to annihilate the Jewish people and the Jewish state. I think that that was correct. However, 2 points, and this is why I think he should be set aside. The first is, I think we hear Kahane Tzadak, but Kahane was far from the first to recognize this, and we say it all the time. And Golda Meir is quoted left, right, and center as saying that we will only have peace from the Arabs when they love their children more than they hate ours and want to kill our children. Right? He's far from the only one. The revisionists that he revered. He grew up with Vladimir Jabotinsky's son, visiting his childhood home in Brooklyn. So he was exposed to these ideas from a young age. I mean, we have great Zionist leaders, whether it be about the Arabs or others as well, who saw these ideas long before Kahane, and not all of them are associated with right-wing politics. Many of them are not. Ben Gurion is certainly not seen as a crazy right-winger. He understood this, quite frankly, just as well as Kahane or anyone else, and I would argue more accurately, because he understood that he saw shades of gray where Kahane was unable to, and yet he was able to fight the war in 1948. So we can't walk around in Begin as well, and I don't think think we should walk around calling Begin a Kahanist. Anyone that's obviously not the case in so many key respects. So the first point is, why are we only introducing Kahana when so many great heroic Israelis and others have recognized these ideas and acted upon them for decades upon decades, if not longer, long before Kahana arrived on the scene, and without introducing so many of the pernicious attitudes, ideas, theological assumptions and assertions that come along with the Kahana package. So you want to say Ben Gurion Sadak? Gesundheit. Go ahead and say that. Why are you walking around with your Kahanet Sadak? That's really not fair. That's number one. And number two, I think Kahana comes with other things that I think are very dangerous. I think that we haven't touched on that it's not a coincidence that he was convicted as a terrorist. It's not a coincidence that he was someone who was found by the FBI to have, this is not hearsay, this is based on rigorous studies that, or examination of evidence. I'm not the only one. Scholars who have looked at this objectively have concluded that it's very clear that not only did his supporters engage in murder, thinking that they were of egregious acts of murder on the basis of his his rhetoric and arguably his encouragement. And not only that, but he was planning to develop chemical weaponry in order to use against the Russians. This is not me. This is FBI documents. So I think we have to be very, very clear-minded about the potential dangers of overcorrecting. If we see this as a Kahanist supremacist theocracy that we're going for, essentially a kind of like an almost Ayatollah-list equivalent of Iran that we're looking to found, that we think we should be clear-eyed and know that that's what he wanted. That's not what's under discussion today. That's not what Trump is discussing. It's not what any of us are discussing. What we're discussing is what can we do to ensure the safety and security of the Jewish people? And we run a tremendous risk of legitimating Jewish violence, violence that we would all see is completely out of bounds, Jewish terrorism that we would, I think, all rightly dismiss as completely unacceptable and outside of the bounds of discourse, not because it's outside of the bounds of discourse and therefore we seek to disqualify it, but rather simply because we think it's wrong. So I think those are, where it's both intellectually dishonest and also exceedingly dangerous to quote him and introduce him in conversations where, quite frankly, he has no place.
I'd like to add one more point, which I think is important. I don't know if you'll have anything to comment on this, but I just want to put it out there as well, which is, apart from everything else, which you said, with which I certainly agree, for someone who claims that he's motivated by Avat Yisrael, the love of Jews, he sure seems to sound like an anti-Semite a lot. He did not have any use for Jews who disagreed with him, and he speaks about them in extremely negative terms. It drips with dislike and contempt. It's not very impressive to say how much you love Jews when you're talking about Jews in theory and not Jews in fact. And I think this is a good example of that phenomenon. People who say they love Jews and love Jews in theory, but when it comes to actual flesh and blood Jews, they very much don't love them. In fact, they strongly dislike them or hate them, and they're very clear about that. And I believe, from reading his writings, that Meir Kahane is a prime example of that kind of person, someone who is lauded for his love of Israel, when in fact, that's a love which is purely theoretical. In actual fact, when it comes to Jews who actually exist, no use for them whatsoever.
That's interesting. I would tend to agree. I think that, it's interesting. We have all these conversations about Jewish unity all the time, etc. And it's very easy to get on our, ideological high horses and to lecture about the dangers, the implications for Churban Bayit Sheni and so on and so forth. But I would fully agree. Ahavat Yisrael, love for Israel, is not rooted in an ideology, and it will never achieve by an ideology that demonizes our Jewish enemies, including the greatest rabbis in our generation, dismissing Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg in writing. I mean, the leading Poskei Hador and people who really were Jew-loving people. It's not just about ideology; it's about actually walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Okay, Tzvi, as a final question, let me ask you why you think he has such appeal, or more specifically, why, to the degree it hasn't happened in quite a while, his appeal seems to be growing right now.
Sure. And I want to add one point that we haven't touched on, Scott, if I may, with your permission, and then I'll certainly
Absolutely.
come to that. Yeah, I just want to say that one of the things that I've heard from Israelis who have, I've been outspoken about not introducing and reintroducing Kahana into mainstream discourse for all the reasons that we're discussing today. I'm really glad to have this opportunity. But one of the things that I've heard from Israelis are really two things I think are important to mention here. Number one is I've heard from a lot of Israelis who have said, look, the resurgence of popularity is not in Israel. We're not seeing that, at least on the ground in Israel. Maybe you're seeing that in America. So I just want to be clear that I am not commenting on any sort of resurgence of ideology in Israel. I do have deep concerns about Ben Gvir. That can be a separate conversation. They're not entirely unrelated. I think his name absolutely should be mentioned in this conversation. But I think it's also important to realize that someone can support certain politicians or certain perspectives about politicians without kind of like, maintaining that the discourse or even the theology surrounding it is acceptable. I personally happen to find Ben Gvir's policies completely unacceptable, completely, frankly, racist. And I see him as very much a devotee of Kahana. But I think it's important to say that Israelis, even Israelis who have voted for him or who find Ben Gvir to be absolutely unacceptable, are also saying, look, I have a lot of cousins who come to me and they say, I think Ben Gvir, the way that he's talking and others are talking is horrible. I just don't know how I'm going to keep my children alive. I feel failed by the establishment. I feel like our security has not been taken seriously. I really don't know what to do. I feel stuck between a rock and a hard place. I'm kind of holding my nose. The last thing that I wanted to do, I just want my children to have a future. I just want a future for the state of Israel. Now, I'm not in a position to judge, which politician is going to give us a future, but I think it's important to say the Israelis here are not coming and saying, oh, Khan's ideology is alive and well. What they're saying is that we just want our children to be alive and well. I think that's a really important point. And the second thing I'm hearing from them, I think is important to mention as well, is that the issues of Kahana are not the most important conversations happening today. And I want to echo that, and I want to agree with it. I think it's very, very important to say that the conversations that Israelis are having about Miluim and about the hostages and about the war and about the Jewish survival and about what to do with Gaza and in Gaza and the next steps and the future of Israeli leadership and so on and so forth. I think these are the essential questions, and we can have these really, really hard conversations without introducing Kahana. I think that's very important. It's just that I want to add to those conversations that there is a concurrent danger, especially we're seeing in America, of overreacting, of going too far in the opposite direction. I'm not saying this at all to my Israeli brethren. I'm rather saying it in context of the Anglo and American discourse that I'm hearing today, and I think it's important to comment on.
Okay, I appreciate you bringing that up. Those are very important points. Can we now move into that idea of the source of his appeal?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And I touched on it there. I think that there is, for very good reason, there is terror and there is a sense of immense fear that even if it's not technically existential, it sure feels existential. Our enemies would sure like it to be existential, always have. And I think that for understandable reasons, but at the same time for dangerous reasons. I think at times when we feel disempowered and we feel terrified and afraid and don't see other ready answers, we're going to tend to turn to extremism. That temptation will always be there. And I think it's really important to be aware this is far from the first time when fundamentalist extremism has become more attractive at times when it would have been possible, and I think much more sagacious to say, okay, many of the answers that we've tried until this point have not succeeded. Why is that? And where can we be Torah true and what I believe really is a more persuasive and more correct reading of the Torah tradition without going to the opposite extreme? I understand the difficulty. I'm living it through myself, not in Israel, but in America, together with my American brethren, together with with you and all the Israelis, as best we humanly can, together with you every single step of the way. But I think that I fear, and so many of my colleagues and friends fear, that we can be misled into thinking that going to the opposite extreme will give us the answers that we're looking for. But we need not create a new set of problems. We need to instead face the very real problems that we are confronting, think about them with fresh ideas, but they need not be racist ideas. They need not be ideas that will help us building a state that looks like a Jewish version of Iran. I don't think that that's what Torah believes. I don't think that that's what we believe. And I don't think that those are the kinds of directions that we want to see for ourselves, for our children. Certainly don't want terrorism emerging from our ranks. We don't want any of these things. So I think that we understand the new desire, we understand the new resurgence of interest and popularity, but I think it's upon us to show another way.
And let me just add 2 points to what you just made, to the point with which I agree again. One of them may be a characteristic of extremism, but there is something very comforting about a shallow, easy to understand policy that someone adopts. Hey, if we do this simple thing, it will solve all of our problems. Why doesn't anybody see it as clearly as I do? We hear that repeatedly with shallow extremist policies. And I believe Kahanism certainly falls into that category. And the reason that, why don't they do that? Isn't it obvious? The answer is no, because once you grow up and learn that you're no longer an 11th grader and you understand that the world has nuance and things are complicated, it's not so simple. When it looks so simple, they usually mean it's simplistic, not simple and good, but shallow and silly. And ultimately, certain ideas which on the surface may sound attractive because they would solve all of our problems are far from being ways of actually solving those problems. And the second point I'd like to make is that Meir Kahane was quite charismatic. I heard him speak myself 5 days before he was murdered at Brandeis University in 1990. And people came there to protest him, and they were standing up there and shouting at him, and he destroyed them. He was a far more charismatic speaker than they were. He made mincemeat out of them. He knew how to debate extremely well. That doesn't make it right. It means that he was very good at that. And I think that in some level, this can alert us to the problems with charismatic authority. When people are liked, when people are held up as examples largely because of their charisma. And let me add, his writing is also very good. He's a very entertaining writer. When people are seen as charismatic authorities, sometimes it allows us to ignore their more problematic ideas or the shallowness of their ideas. I think that might also add to the specific problem relevant to Meir Kahane.
Yeah, 100%, Scott. I'm with you on both points. I just want to add one point, which is that I think sometimes those who avoid extremism tend to make a technical, but a very important tactical mistake, which is that they struggle because they eschew extremism and oversimplification of complex problems. They fail to provide emotionally resonant solutions that are also intellectually coherent and persuasive. And I think that if I were to, walk away with one task that I think stands before us, those of us who seek to combat the rise of extremism and the temptations of grotesquely oversimplified perspectives that create their own set of problems instead of just simply magically solving all the very real problems that exist. I think we do have to find something that is not oversimplified, but still emotionally resonant. That is what will work with the wider community. We can't just be saying, well, this is complicated and that's complicated, and not that you're suggesting that, God forbid. But I think that if I were to walk away with one of the takeaways is that instead of saying just rejecting those extremes, I think thinking about, well, what authentic, what I believe is an authentic Torah view would really not only be more true or Torah true than Kahane claims, no matter how confident and charismatic, as you say, he was when he presented it, but one that will resonate with their people in such a dark time.
Well, avoiding simplicity while at the same time offering an emotionally resonant answer that's not just saying it's complicated. That's clearly a very difficult and weighty job, but we have to be up for it or else we open ourselves to extremist, simplistic answers. I appreciate it. Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for your time, and it's truly been a pleasure.
This episode of The Orthodox Conundrum is brought to you by Jewish Communal Fund, JCF, where strategic philanthropy meets impact. Tax season is the perfect time to open a JCF donor-advised fund, a smart, tax-efficient way to maximize your deductions while supporting the causes you care about. With JCF, you can simplify your charitable giving and recommend grants on your own timeline. Open a fund with just $5,000 and start giving with purpose. If you open a fund in 2025, JCF will grant $100 to an organization of your choice. Visit jcfny.org/Orthodox Conundrum to request an information kit. That's jcfny.org/Orthodox Conundrum. The link is in the description of this podcast. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.